Welcome back, everyone. It is Eric from Ricandy, and today we're going to be checking out what's been winning over in Japan for the month of February, including a look at all of the winners from the massive 3,000-person Champions League tournament that recently wrapped up over there. So I know that tournament has been getting, a decent bit of attention in the community, but there were also a lot of City League tournaments, which are kind of like the equivalent of a League Cup, bigger than the normal shop tournaments Japan has, that were also happening that had some pretty interesting tournament results that I don't think people have really picked up on. So we're going to check out all of these today, courtesy of our friends over at PokemonCard.io. They've been doing a great job at compiling all of these Japanese tournament results. And even though we're going to look at a decent chunk of decks, there's still honestly a ton of lists that I'm not even going to be able to cover in this video. So if you guys want to see all of the winning decks for the month of February, I'm going to link that down below in the description so you can head over to PokemonCard.io and check those out for yourself. But with that being said, remember to smack that like button, feed that always hungry YouTube algorithm. Let's jump in and see what's winning over there in Japan. So of course, we're going to start off with that massive 3,000-person Champions League tournament, and this is going to be a breakdown of what made it into top 16. Surprisingly though, only the one Giratina V-Star. Giratina, I think, definitely had a lot of hype going into this tournament. Now, we don't have a full breakdown of every day 2 deck that made it over there, so maybe this deck still did really well, but only one made it into top 16. I'm not really sure exactly, but kind of a surprise turnout for Giratina. Likewise, we also see 4 Lugia V-Stars in top 16 as well, which definitely caught some people off guard. I think a lot of people have kind of written off Lugia after rotation since it loses. Let's be real, it loses a lot. It loses all of its special energies, save for like double turbo. You're losing basically all of your good attackers. You're basically just keeping Lugia, Archeops, and DTE essentially. So to still see it perform so well in this format was, honestly kind of a shock to me. They are choosing to play it with the single strike engine, which of course we will check out. I'm going to break down lists for all of these, of course. And then we actually have Gardevoir making its way into top 16 as well, which, I don't want to say I'm surprised by, but in my sort of early testing with Gardevoir, the deck feels decent, but for a massive 3,000 person event, I'm surprised 2 made it up there. I'm not going to lie. But one thing that is important to remember about Japan's format for these tournaments is that these are going to be best of 1, whereas over here internationally, we're playing a best of 3 series at regionals, internationals, etc. And it's typically a little bit more difficult for a stage 2 deck to play 3 games in that time. So that might be a factor that's contributing to how well it actually did here. But hey, I'm definitely here for it. I love seeing stage 2 decks make it this far in a tournament. But let's go ahead and actually check out some of these lists though. So this is going to be the winner of the entire tournament. This is going to be Lost Box. And at a glance, honestly, it doesn't really seem that far off from what you might see even in like a current pre-Scarlet and Violet tournament. The big absence is going to be Scoop Up Net. But other than that, guys, I mean, this is Lost Box kind of as you know it. And that might be a reason this deck did so well, just because it does lose so few cards in the rotation and still has answers to so many different decks in the format. So as you can see, they are choosing sort of, actually the 1 count of Cramorant is kind of surprising. 2 is usually sort of the staple that we see, but they do have the 2 copies of Clara, so maybe they can just, reuse it that way. We got 2 Sableye, we got a Zamazenta, we have Drapion and Raikou plus the Sky Sealstone. That definitely seems good. So again, guys, I think a lot of this is going to look pretty much as you would expect for a Lost Box deck. And for Lost Box players, that's definitely a good thing. That means they don't really have to adapt their list that much to this new format. So for the second place deck, that's going to be Gardevoir EX, of course, losing in the finals to Lost Box, but definitely some cards and some counts that are sort of catching my eye. As you can see, they're going all in on the Shining Arcana Gardevoirs. They're not playing the Glade that can get supporters. They're leaning really heavily on this thing. And I guess you actually can afford to, since they are playing, I think it's the Mirage Step Curly. I think that's the name of the attack. This thing can accelerate additional Curlias into play. So it's actually not that inconceivable that you can have literally 6 Pokemon in play that are all Gardevoir pieces. And because of that, that actually does sort of allow you to set up multiple of these. Whereas if you weren't playing this Curlia and were just setting up your evolutions normally, you might just be constrained to just 3, maybe 4 Pokemon in play being part of your Gardevoir evolutions. And they are choosing to play, I believe this is the Silver Tempestrals. Don't quote me on that. I think it is, but I believe it has an attack that prevents your opponent from using an attack on their next turn. So I'm not exactly sure what matchup this is for. Like Lost Box decks can, just keep switching over and over, so that can clear the effect. UV Max, of course, plays switching cards. Maybe this is for like, I don't know, Tyranitar V for Lugia? Maybe. Again, I'm really not sure the exact matchup this is for, but I'm sure there's a reason they're playing this instead of just going all in on the 70 HP Ralt over here. But an interesting attacker they have is going to be the Cresselia. Cresselia is actually pretty cool. This is a card I actually did talk about in the Gardevoir article I dropped recently on Patreon. And it seems like the Japanese also sort of recognized how good this card is as well. I think it's particularly good probably for Lost Box decks because Cresselia has an attack where you move 2 of your damage counters off all of your benched Pokemon, I believe it is, to one of your opponents. So if you have damage on all of your Pokemon via Gardevoir EX's ability, you can move all that damage over to your opponent, take maybe a cheap KO, and it's just a way to power up your board with Gardevoir without sort of putting some of your attackers in range of a KO from your opponent on the next turn. And the Cresselia only gives up 1 prize, only attacks for a single energy. So yeah, this card definitely seems pretty good. But I think the really interesting card in their list here is going to be the Emergency Jelly. This is definitely a cute inclusion. So of course it's a tool card. And if your Pokemon it's attached to has 30 HP or less remaining between turns, you can heal, I believe it's 120 from that Pokemon and discard the Emergency Jelly. So yet again, I do think this is a card that is sort of disproportionately good against Lost Box decks. Because let's say we throw a ton of energy onto our Chilling Reign Gardevoir. Well, if you power it up as much as you can, that puts it down to 20 HP, meaning that something normally like a Cramorant, a Sableye, or even like a Psychic Leap from a UV Max player can easily just knock this out. But the Emergency Jelly sort of denies those plays and forces your opponent to commit, much heavier hitting attackers to dealing with some of these Pokemon. And also the Stadium cards in this list definitely caught my eye. They have a Temple of Sinnoh and a Collapse Stadium. Temple of Sinnoh definitely seems pretty good against UV Max, but also I think a little bit more importantly against Lugia V-Star, just because Tyranitar V is going to be a big pain for this deck because they can so easily knock out your Gardevoirs, and being able to just turn all those single strike energies to colorless energies seems really good. I kind of like the double Temple if we're going to go that route, but what do I know? I didn't get second out of 3,000 person tournament. But yeah, definitely some interesting things going on with this Gardevoir list. Now, up next, we have another Lost Box deck that was in top 16, and this one is definitely kind of interesting. They have the Galarian Zapdos V, so I'm assuming this is to maybe deal with things like Miraidon and Regieleki VMAX. Also, potentially Tyranitar V, that's an easy KO on that. Or is Tyranitar weak to Grass? I forget, it's weak to Fighting or Grass. I forget which, but I'm assuming this is more so for the Lightning decks out there. But they also have 2 copies of the Cry of Destruction Yveltal, which is really interesting because if this card was going to see play, I would imagine this is a card that would see play pre-rotation because this is disproportionately good against Lugia, but Lugia is probably a bit worse after rotation, even though it is sort of doing well in this Japanese tournament. So it's kind of interesting to see them playing this. And we can see they're not playing it for the second attack. They're using it just for Cry of Destruction, again, presumably against decks like Mew and also Lugia V-Star. So getting into Lugia V-Star, like I said, this is a deck that is surprisingly still sort of thriving in this post-rotation format. And we have 2 lists that we're going to look at, but this is the higher placing one. I think this was top 8, if I remember correctly. But if you've not yet looked at these post-rotation Lugia lists, they definitely look a good bit different than the pre-rotation ones, especially the Pokemon search cards. They got the 4 Ultra Ball, 4 Capturing Aroma, and then only the 2 Nest Ball here. And the reason for that is just because Nest Ball actually isn't that great outside of getting your attackers into play. Like, you can't activate Lumineon, you can't activate Pumpkaboo, so instead they are just leaning more heavily on the Capturing Aromas to be able to get Pokemon directly into their hand, not directly to their bench. But they also do have the 2 copies of Mesagoza, which I actually do like here. So it's Pokeball, but as a Stadium card, so it's just another way to help guarantee that we get Archeops into our hand immediately. But speaking of Archeops, we can see they're actually playing double Professor Burnett. They're actually playing more copies of Burnett than they are Professor's Research, which is kind of crazy to think about here. They're just saying, you know what, post-rotation, it's really tough to get Archeops in the discard compared to pre-rotation. We're going to play a couple of these just to immediately search a deck and discard them to be able to guarantee that we can get that turn 2 Summoning Star ability off with Lugia. So instead of the big crazy toolbox of attackers we've seen pre-rotation, it looks like they are favoring sort of this single strike engine with the Stonjourner and Tyranitar, plus the single strike energies, And one thing this deck actually gains from using this whole engine is actually gets access to Urn of Vitality and gives Lugia a way to actually recycle special energies, whereas in the past, it really hasn't had that sort of ability at its disposal. But both these attackers actually fit in really well for this particular meta because, of course, we have the Sojourner that's going to knock out all of the different lightning stuff running around, and then we have Tyranitar to deal with things like Mew Max and Gardevoir EX as well. And it looks like they're actually playing the full 4 count of Double Turbo, which is a little bit surprising as well, but I guess does make some sense since all of the retreat cost of all of your Pokemon are kind of terrible, if we're being honest. Lugia has a 2 retreat, Tyranitar is 3, Sojourner's 3, so your Pokemon aren't as mobile as they maybe were pre-rotation here. You know, a lot of the list is pretty self-explanatory. I think maybe other than the Radiant Serena, we should probably highlight that. I'm actually not sure the reason they are playing this. I would assume it's for Lost Box, just to fix some of the chip damage that they're doing throughout the course of a game, maybe throw off their math a little bit, so that could make sense. But here we have one more Lugia list I want to take a look at. This is in top 16 of the Champions League tournament, and I think this list overall looks probably maybe a little bit closer to what people were expecting from post-rotation Lugia. They aren't playing the Radiant Serena, they are only playing the 3 V-Star. You know, their supporter count I think is a little bit more in line with what we've seen from pre-rotation. And even the energy count as well, they're still only playing the 2 Double Turbo instead of ramping up to the 3 or 4 count. So interesting to see these Lugia lists going in kind of very different directions, but still both taking very strong finishes at the end of the day. And for our last top 16 deck list, we're going to take a look at Mew Max, but this one is kind of interesting. They're playing 2 copies of Deoxys, which is a little bit puzzling. I'm sure there's a specific reason this is in the deck, but its attack, if you guys aren't familiar with it, it's 80, I think plus 80 more if you have a Fusion Strike energy attached, which of course they play. This is going to be the Elisa Sparkle version of the deck. And my thought is, well, Meloetta already gives you that sort of single prize option to deal with, you know, other single prize decks, or, you know, just in general to skew the prize trade in your favor. So I'm wondering the specific matchup this is for. I was thinking maybe I could see Lost Box just because Deoxys has 120 HP. Kramer, it's not going to be able to one-shot it like they can with Meloetta. So that definitely seems possible. But beyond that, honestly not sure, but they're doing something right. It's important enough for them to commit to 2 copies of this card. Other than that, though, I think this list looks, you know, pretty standard from UV Max. I don't think you guys need me to explain what this deck does. I think the only other interesting cards we have here are going to be the Hisuian Heavy Wall, not a card we see often in Mew, and then also no copies of Path to the Peak. It looks like for their stadium cards, they're choosing to go with, it looks like seemingly Path counters. They got a Lost City, a Collapse, and then 2 copies of Lost Vacuum as well. But very interesting take on UV Max. So that's going to be all of the list we're looking at for the Champions League tournament. Unfortunately, the Giratina list in top 16 was not available when I record this video. And also, I want to point out, we saw no Miraidon EX in that top 16. Now, that's not to say there weren't Miraidons in day 2 of the Champions League tournament, but none of them really had a very deep run. So I'm curious to see how that translates internationally. I'm not sure if it just got hated out of the tournament by sort of counters for it, but it still has been doing pretty well over in Japan, and we're still going to take a look at some winning lists for those City League tournaments in a little bit too, where the winning lists actually were a little bit different. We have some pretty cool things to check out for those, so let's see what did well in those tournaments. So up first, we have a winning Arctina list, which is, you know, I think a very bare bones, very just straightforward streamlined list, not really any crazy techs. Even the supporter count and sort of the engine looks very similar to what we've seen, you know, really in the pre-Silver Tempest Arceus decks. So of course, Giratina is still just a good attacker. 280 is enough to knock out most relevant things. And with a choice belt, that's going to get you over the edge to knock out even other things like the Mew Maxes of the world, like the Gardevoir EXs of the world, etc. I'm hoping, since Lugia has gotten a little bit of a nerf after the rotation, that these styles of Arceus decks can once again be viable, since I really do actually enjoy these. But speaking of Giratina V-Star, we also have a more traditional Lost Zone focused version of the deck doing well. We actually saw Giratina winning a lot of these city leagues throughout the month, and I think this is a pretty decent snapshot of what these decks are, you know, starting to look like. But the one thing I did notice is that a lot of players weren't playing Beach Court. It seemed like a lot were favoring other cards like either Temple of Sinnoh or Path to the Peak, this list included. We also see they're playing a copy of the Forest Sealstone which I think might look a little bit weird at a glance because you usually want to save your V-Star power for that very powerful Star Requiem attack. But, I guess maybe there's going to be certain matchups where Giratina isn't as good as just leaning on your normal Lost Zone attackers. So maybe this can be good in those instances to just sort of forego your V-Star and use this maybe just to help get more quickly set up. I think that's definitely a possibility. So next up, we have a couple of different Miraidon lists. And like I said, this was a deck that was seemingly absent from the upper echelons of the Champions League tournament. But this deck was still very well represented in the City League, so it definitely does seem like the deck is still decent. But this list looks very, very straightforward, actually kind of similar to the one that I posted on the channel not too long ago. But they do have the super thick count of lightning energy just to ensure they can always hit lightning energies off of their electricity generators. They also have the Klefkis, which I'm a huge fan of. I think that's really one of the only ways you can win against the Lost Zone decks. I think the big omissions I'm seeing here, though, are going to be Drapion V and Raikou V. Those are some of the more popular support Pokemon that a lot of these Miraidon decks have been playing. And typically along with them, since these decks play Arven, we've seen them playing Sky Sealstone. But it looks like they've just opted to cut all of that for just higher counts of their existing cards that they have here. And you can even see they have very heavy Gust count as well. 3 Serena, 2 Boss. So this is a very straightforward Miraidon deck, but, it looks like it's pretty consistent, though. You don't have a whole lot of crazy tricks at your disposal other than the Klefkis. And I guess the thought is that's going to be enough to get you across the finish line in most games. So now we have a list that's going to be sort of on the other end of the spectrum, whereas that one was, I think, a little bit more streamlined and straightforward. This one's a little bit wackier. And I will say Flying Pikachu in particular has been a card that seems to be popping up more and more in these Japanese lists. So is this going to become a staple of Miraidon? Still, I think a little too early to say. So instead of going the Klefki route to help beat these Lost Zone decks, it looks like they're using Flying Pikachu instead, and is also a pretty good attacker against Lugia, since things like Stonjourner and Tyranitar V actually won't be able to damage you here. They're also playing the 1/1 Flaffy and only the 2/2 Regieleki V Max. So I will say I'm actually not sure how much I like this take on the list. Well, I guess before I start saying that, they do at least play 2 choice belts, so that in theory I guess does make up for the thinner Regieleki count. So I guess that makes some sense. They are playing Drapion and Raikou, but no Sky Sealstone, so that just intuitively feels a little bit off to me. And they're even playing their own double Turbo Energy, which is kind of interesting as well, since we can power up Flying Pikachu with that. And actually, because the deck has Arven and 4 Sealstone, you can actually grab the 1 DTE on the turns that you might need it. So I do have some somewhat conflicting thoughts on the direction of this list, but I think the big takeaway is the Flying Pikachu, as that is a card that, like I said, has been popping into more and more of these Miraidon decks. But I'm definitely curious what you guys think. Do you like the more straightforward take on Miraidon, or do you like the more teched out version like this? Curious what your thoughts are down in the comments. Surprisingly, Magnezone EX, along with Magnezone V-Star, man, this person just loves Magnezone, also took down one of these tournaments and got first place, which is kind of crazy to me. But I mean, honestly, Magnezone EX isn't the worst card in the world. I think its first attack is 60 for every energy your opponent has in play. And then the second attack, I believe, is 230 or 220. And I think it takes 30 damage, or it can't attack next turn, something kind of like that. We've got Radiant Venusaur, which is also kind of interesting. We got Celebrations Mew, definitely a card that makes sense in like stage 2 decks because it's an easy way to grab rare candy whenever you need to get into your Magnezones. But I think the other sort of weird card in the list is going to be a copy of, I believe it's Jacques. I think that's how you pronounce this character's name. But I think it's just search a deck for 2 evolutions and put them into your hand, or search for 3 evolutions. It's something like that. I think it's 2 though. I'm not sure if this is better than just playing Irida, just because if you already have Magnezone, Irida can grab you rare candy, whereas if you need the evolution, instead of playing Jacques, you can just play Irida and grab your Ultra Ball. But cool card inclusion nonetheless. And yeah, kind of interesting to see Magnezone doing so well. I know Miraidon has kind of been overshadowing it, but hey, I'm down for a stage 2 deck also doing well. And the final deck we're going to take a look at is actually going to be a winning Hisuian Zoroark V Starless. You know, we had seen Zoroark winning a couple of small shop tournaments here and there, but I think this is the first one, if I'm not mistaken, that won one of these bigger City League tournaments, which I think is cool. I really like the Hisuian Zoroark deck. I think it's a really fun deck to play, but it kind of got overshadowed by Giratina when it came out and was kind of gate kept out of the format, I think, a little bit. So if this deck can finally be viable, I'm stoked for it. But overall, I really like how this list looks. It looks kind of what we would expect from a Hisuian Zoroark deck. We even have the Squabbit in the deck now, which I've actually really grown to like in my list that do play Barrel. This card is pretty sick just because you can shuffle your hand, put at the bottom of your deck, draw one, which seems pretty bad, but if you have like a big clunky hand and you can't dig with the barrel, this is a way to put all those useless cards at the bottom and suddenly make your Industrious Incisors active yet again. So I think there would be some consideration for playing Melanie. I could have seen that, but V-Guard Energy is pretty cool. It is going to put your Zoroarks out of one-shot range of something like a Giratina V-Star. Makes you a bit sturdier against Mew as well. But definitely cool to see Zoroark taking a dub. I really hope this deck can finally catch on. But that's going to do it for all the lists that we're going to be checking out today. Like I mentioned, though, there were a ton of decks winning over in Japan for the month of February. Again, I focused today more heavily on the bigger tournaments, but there were still a ton of smaller shop tournaments with all sorts of other crazy decks I didn't even cover winning. So definitely head on over to PokemonCard.io if you want to see the rest of what did well. But I definitely want to hear from you guys down below in the comment section. What do you think of all these decks that were winning over there in Japan? Are there any decks that sort of surprised you by how well they performed or even underperformed? Let me know your full thoughts down below in the comment section. But as always, guys, if you did enjoy today's content, remember to leave a like on the video. And if you're feeling maybe a little extra generous and want to take that support to the next level, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.